So as we know, sitting in the audience, that तालियां तो बजानी पड़ेंगी बार बार, right? और बार बार सुनना पड़ेगा स्टेज से थोड़ा और जोर से. But I want to give you a little selfish incentive to do that, and that is the acupressure points which are in your palms. You know that, right? Yeah? So if you have no good reason to applaud, just do it for your own sake, knowing that whenever you do that, you're igniting yourself, you're evoking the energy within you to be here, which is what is going to give us the return on the investment of our time together. Well, let me now bring on stage the insights of someone who is an absolute honor to be among. We would have loved him to be here in person, and he even agreed to be here. But unfortunately, because of his meeting with the finance minister, he's not been able to join us live. But he will be here in the room, sharing the insights that we can learn a lot from. I'm talking about our honorable chief guest for today, Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran. I could end the introduction for him by just saying that he's a chief economic advisor to the government of India, but I would like you to know what it takes to get there. So be with me as I read through some of the important accomplishments that will inspire us to get to where he's brought himself in his lifetime, and help us understand what is it that we need to bring to our lives. So Dr. Anantha has co-authored 4 books: The Rise of Finance, Cause, Consequences, and Cures; Derivatives, Can India Grow? The Economics of Derivatives. He was a weekly columnist for Mint from 2007 to Feb 2022. He has taught at several business schools and institutes of management in India and in Singapore. He was a distinguished visiting professor of economics at Korea University. He was a part-time member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India from 2019 to 21. He's an honorary senior advisor to the International Financial Services Authority of India. He also advised the Indicus Foundation on Financial Inclusion and Dwara Research on Financial System Design. He served on the advisory boards of TVS Capital and the Global Alliance for Mass Entrepreneurship. In his corporate career spanning 17 years from 1994 to 2011, he was a currency economist at Union Bank of Switzerland, head of research and investment consulting in Credit Suisse Private Banking in Asia, head of Asia Research and Global Chief Investment Officer at Bank Julius Baer. He was an independent director on the boards of TVS Supply Chain Solutions, Sundaram Fasteners, TVS Tires, and Delphi TVS. He earned his doctorate degree from the University of Massachusetts in 1994 for his work on exchange rate behavior. In 1985, he received postgraduate diploma in management from IIM Ahmedabad. This is as brief a bio as I could possibly give for Dr. V. Anantha. Please put your hands together to welcome him up on the screen. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you for those very generous words of introduction. But I was reminded of what my first boss in Union Bank of Switzerland said back in 1994 when I joined. After my PhD in the US, I was in Zurich to take up my job as a currency economist in UBS. And the first thing he said was that life is but a series of accidents. In other words, we don't really plan and execute many of these things, just as even though we might think that we actually do so. So I think keeping that perspective in mind is good, not just for keeping oneself grounded, but it is also a good thing to remember, even for investment advisors. In other words, humans are prone to attribute personal parentage to successes and orphan failures. And nowhere it is more prominent on a daily basis than it is in the world of investments. And since I have been on this side of the divide, that is on your side, being investment advisors, running teams that were called variously investment advisory and investment consulting, for high net worth individual clients, looking at markets, looking at the macro economy, etc. I thought I would mention this, and that is what will, I think, enable you to take your wrong calls in stride, and at the same time, over time, deliver value to your clients. Thank you for those very kind words of introduction once again, nonetheless. And as she correctly said at the very beginning, I would have liked to be there, but certain very unavoidable commitments and requirements to stay behind in Delhi. In fact, if it is of any consolation, I was expected to be in Mumbai today and tomorrow for several events, including yours, but all of them are not happening. And there is a conference hosted by SEBI tomorrow, and even for that conference, I have to be present virtually. So if it is of any consolation, so that is the reality of the world that I have chosen to inhabit. And therefore, please accept my sincere apologies for not being there in person in Mumbai this morning with all of you. My brief today is to share with you how we look at India, its trajectory in the recent past, and its outlook in the coming years, and also paint some of the challenges that we will be inevitably facing as we journey towards higher material standards of living. So the title of my presentation is Being Bullish in an Era of Uncertainty. Can the next decade be India's era? It's a question mark, because as in the world of investing in anything, it is not necessary nor desirable to assume the conclusion that you want to see happen. Next slide. In the near term, I think there is enough reason to be optimistic. GDP growth in the current financial year, which is going to end in a few weeks, is actually closer to 8%. And that is quite possible because unless the fourth quarter GDP numbers fall very significantly from the momentum that we have seen in the first three quarters, GDP will be closer to 8% rather than 7.6, as the Ministry of Statistics is currently estimating. And as far as the International Monetary Fund's forecast is concerned, it is on the lower side, but they do take the time to revise their estimates. But nonetheless, in comparison to the rest of the world or in G20, India tops the list in terms of the actual growth rate that it is achieving. You might say that for a developing country, high growth rates are usually the norm compared to developed countries because the base is higher. But it is worth noting that even among emerging market economies, India's growth rate stands out. And as you can see on this slide, agriculture growth has been somewhat tepid because we had an erratic monsoon. Kharif crop was on the weaker side compared to the previous year. But hopefully this year in 2024, we will have the possibility of a good Rabi crop because Rabi sowing has been very good. And the El Nino conditions are going to withdraw by April, according to some global forecasting agencies. And the monsoon should be better. And therefore, agricultural growth in 2024 might be contributing. But nonetheless, both industry and services sectors are growing very well. And it is not often the case that an economy as large and diverse as ours, there will be always pockets of weakness. We have to accept that, but look at the bigger picture. And then if you look at the private consumption, gross fixed capital formation are going to be important growth drivers. In simple terms, it is how much Indians are able to consume and how much Indian businesses are able to invest are going to be important contributors. Exports will be there, but unlike in the very first decade of the millennium when global growth was very strong, this time around we can't expect global exports to be our biggest growth driver, because the world economy is beset with uncertainties, both political and economic. Now, why do I expect gross fixed capital formation to be much higher. And I just already spoke to you about the prospects for agricultural growth. Let me first turn to that before I get on to the two important drivers of growth, which I mentioned earlier, investments and consumption. But this is exactly all the important drivers about the strength of the agricultural sector, whether it is credit to agriculture and whether it is a slight increase in the sowing of rabi crops or availability of fertilizers, and also in general for the urban consumers, availability of food stock, etc. All these things do paint a picture of reasonable health in the farming sector, if not robust health. The next slide shows you the reasons for being optimistic, more optimistic on the industrial sector. The Purchasing Managers Index on your top left, Index of Industrial Production and Core Industries Growth on your right top, whether it is consumption of steel and cement, and in general, whether it is about the goods carried by the railways, free traffic. So there is a clear signal that industry is optimistic, investing and producing more, and the Purchasing Managers Index lying above the 50 neutral level, above which it signifies expansion, below which it signifies contraction in manufacturing activity, has been so consistently above 50 since April 2021, also attests to the strength of the economic recovery post-COVID. In the services sector, the picture is more or less the same, if anything, even better. You have the Purchasing Managers Index expanding, not only staying above 50, but further expanding. And then the volume of digital transactions, which is not just about services, but also creating formalization and financial inclusion. And whether it is the hospitality sector or tourism in terms of foreign tourist arrivals finally climbing above the pre-COVID average. The services sector, and if you might also take a look at the external trade in services, it is actually in surplus. So you have enough indications to suggest that there is momentum in the economy, if not in agriculture, but definitely in industry and services. As with growth and output, what about inflation? Ultimately, consumption is also driven by cost of living. What you see is that compared to the first 1.5 decades of the new millennium, in the last 9 years or so, the average inflation rate has definitely come down, but also the volatility of inflation is also much lower. And of course, inflation is a function of both food and non-food items, and food inflation has been a challenge. But then that is why essential food items are being given free for 5 years for almost 80 crore people in the country. And that is a recognition that while India may have eliminated extreme poverty, as per the recent household consumption expenditure data, there is still a vast majority of people for whom food constitutes a very significant portion of their monthly income. And that needs to come down further and further. Until that happens, there is a certain necessity to continue the protection given for their food consumption, such that their disposable income for other items of expenditure is still there. So that is the reason why PM Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana was extended for 5 more years. But overall, apart from these specific indicators, we have also constructed what we call the macro vulnerability index, which is the line on top, which is shown in red because that was a height of macro vulnerability. It came down since FY14, went up during COVID years, and has begun to trend down again. So in other words, it is not just as the growth is happening, but it is also a period of reduced uncertainty in general, which is a combination of 3 parameters: fiscal deficit, current account deficit, and overall inflation rate. The belief that the government is more focused on public investments and infrastructure creation is true, but it is not the only focus. Because if you look at the overall increase in social spending, and in the bottom, you can see the items that go into this chart. And by the way, this is not just the union government, but also the state governments. They are together, the spending on social services as a percentage of the total government expenditure has been rising from very low levels, or even pre-COVID, the levels of 25%, it has gone up to 26%. And the actual numbers on the left scale are going up from nearly 10 lakh crores to over 20 lakh crores in a space of 8 years, showing 9% growth rate. So in other words, there is no neglect or indifference to the necessity that the drivers of growth and the fruits of growth must accrue to all segments of the population. And I will run through this slide relatively faster. This talks about the various initiatives taken for improving the physical health, because ultimately, as we learned during COVID, physical health is eventually a necessary ingredient of economic health. A healthy population is a productive population. And that is why I think I will also mention this as an important risk for India going forward, given the fact that the National Family Health Survey number 5, which was completed between 2019 and 21, shows that the obesity levels, or the BMI index in India, has been rising across rural and urban, poor and rich, women and men, boys and girls, and across age, income, occupation, geography, etc. There is an increase in BMI, and therefore investment in health is not just a question of spending money on the part of the governments, union or state governments, but also our personal initiative, because that is an important challenge for India's growth aspirations going forward. We need to have a healthy population, investing in physical activity, being proactive about screen time, about sedentary activities, about our lifestyle, about our eating schedules, etc., especially as we go into the middle age. So that is an important challenge. While the government takes many initiatives, as shown in this slide, the bulk of the responsibility lies with the population as well. But from a government perspective, many of the health parameters, such as institutional delivery, out-of-pocket health expenditure, which has come down because of insurance coverage, child mortality ratio, maternal mortality ratio, all these things are showing a healthy downward trend, as it should, and in some cases upward trend, like institutional birth, as it should be. Coming to education, because health and education are the two important social infrastructure for driving higher growth. It is not just public investment in physical infrastructure. The number of IITs, IIMs, universities, medical colleges, enrollment in higher education have all picked up. And there is an increase in the National Employability Index, which is a test conducted by the Confederation of Indian Industries, together with a subsidiary of ETS, Education Testing Service in the US, called VBox. And you can look it up in the CII VBox, WHEE National Employability Index. And that is going up. That is, the Indian college graduates are becoming more employable rather than less in the last 10 years. That also attests to the fact that our education syllabuses and teaching are keeping up with the requirements of the industry and services growth. And more than that, more girls are now getting enrolled in higher education. If you look at the drastic improvement on the right side, number of female students per 100 male students, look at the gap being almost fully closed. And this is the reason why labor force participation of young women in the workforce is lower, because they are now enrolling in higher education, and this fruits of this will begin to manifest and be available to us in the coming decades. And jobs indeed are being created, although, as you can see here, the net payroll additions is increasing. Exits from the National Employee Provident Fund Organization are coming down. There has been a very clear increase in the net payroll additions in FY23 and FY24. And the female labor force participation rate, as I mentioned, has been increasing, although the surveys are two different surveys. Before 2017-18 and post 2017-18 is a different survey, so they are not exactly comparable. This is your right side chart. In terms of the investment outlook, you can see that the culture of entrepreneurship is no longer something that is confined to the metros. It is happening all over the country. Many educational institutions have incubators within their campuses and startup culture. And more importantly, yesterday I was in Ahmedabad speaking about the insolvency and bankruptcy code. The biggest benefit of this is that it removes the stigma of failure in a country where failure is loss of face. But insolvency is not the end, it is just the close of one chapter. And for a startup culture to thrive, you need that insolvency as an exit option and for a recommencement of another journey. So all these things are all forming, collecting together, coalescing together to create a vibrant entrepreneurial culture. Now, finally, I would say, when it comes to near-term optimism, the banking sector and the commercial sector, the corporate sector, were saddled with high debt in the second decade. 2011 to 20, it was all about repairing balance sheets. Now that task is completed. Banks are in good health, so are corporate balance sheets, and that is why credit growth is beginning to happen. Non-food credit growth, excluding personal loans, is growing at 15%, including personal loans is growing at 20%. If anything, you might argue that credit growth, if anything, needs to be slightly lower because deposits have to keep pace. Otherwise, interest rates will rise. Overall, the non-performing assets as a ratio of overall debt has been coming down, and that is a very good sign that at least for the next 7 to 8 years, hopefully, the banking sector will continue to lend without worrying about the next down cycle in the banking health. And that inevitably will come because human habits never change. But hopefully we have a window of at least 7 to 8 years before bad habits return. The goods and services tax has contributed to a creation of a national single market. 440 tax rates were combined into 40 tax rates, and it has improved the operational efficiency of Indian trucks. They used to travel 225 kilometers a day on average. Now it has come down to, it has improved to 300 to 325 kilometers post GST, and the logistics cost as a percentage of total value has come down from 14% down to 10 to 12%. Physical infrastructure creation is an important factor in improving the productivity of the economy. India never had a proper industrial cycle. It is not that India never could achieve industrialization. It was because it lacked the infrastructure. So India never prematurely deindustrialized. It actually didn't industrialize enough because it lacked the physical infrastructure. And you can see that in the number of airports doubling in just 8 years, what took 7 decades to build earlier. Electrified rail routes or cargo traffic or national highways going up by 50% in just 8 to 9 years. The physical infrastructure which we are able to see ourselves when we travel or when we drive or when we take the train is going to improve the manufacturing share of GDP. It is not just the Atmanirbhar Bharat program or the production-linked incentive scheme that will increase the share of manufacturing. They are important, but equally important is the building block of physical infrastructure, which has taken a lot of attention and importance and investment in the last 8 to 9 years. I spoke about the importance of insolvency and bankruptcy. IIM Ahmedabad has a study that shows that post-insolvency and bankruptcy, the firm's efficiencies, sales, employee compensation, investments, all parameters improve post-insolvency and resolution. Public digital infrastructure, which you and I use on a daily basis using our barcode, UPI or Google Pay or whatever. India is a global leader in real-time payment transactions. It is not just about efficiency. If you think about it, it is about each one of us leaving a digital footprint. Some of us may not like it. We think it's a privacy issue, but we are long past that. But for small businesses, it actually creates a trail and record of transactions which they can then capitalize on to become financially included, and it also enables their businesses to formalize, become part of the mainstream. So digital infrastructure is about financial inclusion, formalization, and therefore expansion of business opportunities even for the smallest business, because you don't need a physical establishment and overheads to go and market yourself. The cost of reaching out to a global audience has almost collapsed with digital infrastructure. And what about the future? And I spoke about the importance of challenges. I think India has to manage this energy transition in a world that is warming or which is volatile from a climate perspective. At the same time, even when we move from petrol and diesel and coal to renewable energy, to natural gas, to hydrogen, green hydrogen, and nuclear energy, it's very important to ensure that we do not sacrifice our growth aspirations. Developed countries today are in a position to say that climate matters more than economic growth. But at the heart of climate policy must be people and their aspirations. In the name of saving them from climate change 50 years later, we cannot destroy their aspirations today. There is a balance that needs to be struck, and that is what the government of India has been doing, not only in investing in renewable energy, but making sure that the transition is smoother, because this has got geopolitical implications. If all countries in the world move at the same time towards renewable energy, there is a requirement of critical minerals. And many of them are processed in a single country like China. So you will in fact become dependent on one country disproportionately. And there is a necessity to invest in technology for grid storage. Too much of renewable energy feeding into the grid during daytime but not in the evenings could create grid instability. Where do you store the energy generated during daytime? So there are technological issues. If we become more invested in renewable energy, if they become a dominant source of power supply compared to the conventional fuels we use, so these considerations have to be kept in mind. And that is why there is a trade-off between energy security and energy transition. And this has got implications for our medium-term growth as well. I just spoke about the importance of supply chains, how there are top 5 countries. India figures in the top 5 in advanced aircraft engines, in drones, etc. But when you look at other areas, India is still not there in the list. So whether it is technology, whether it is critical minerals, India has to be aware that there is a need to make ourselves secure first, because the world is no longer the same it was between 1980 and 2015. Globalization and efficiency were taken for granted. Now it is about security first, efficiency later. And the production-linked incentive scheme is meant to plug India into the global supply chain. But these things take time. As I always say, many of the economic initiatives take much longer to become reality. And it is usually the time it takes for it to happen is longer than the amount of time it takes for you to put out a tweet. So in the world of social media, impatience on economic policies and outcomes has become an important feature. But we must remember, economic policies act with a lag. They take time to deliver. And then in terms of effective policy, India's average contribution to global GDP will be increasing over time. It is a statistical inevitability in the coming decade. And that is a good thing for India. It will be a country that cannot be ignored and will have to be taken seriously, because it is combining growth, democratic framework, social inclusion, at the same time. This transformation has not been attempted elsewhere before because simply no country has this kind of combination that is happening at the same time. But what, therefore, you can do as an investment advisor is, I think, we should we should basically avoid the temptation to be over exuberant and triumphalist. My own journey as an investment advisor, investment strategist, basically the lesson I learned, for example, between 2004 and 6, I came out of a corporate world and tried to run a global macro hedge fund in Singapore for about 1.5 years. It took 5 months to set it up and 18 months to I actually ran the fund. I had difficulty raising money. I had difficulty attracting talent for a global macro fund. But I always tell people that the best decision I took was not to start the fund, but I tried. More importantly, I knew when to cut my losses and exit that business and get back into the corporate world. So, in other words, in investment advice, given that you are a fiduciary responsibility you carry, it's always important that there is a temptation to generate trades and commissions and through constant advice. But passivity and inactivity are important ingredients of successful long-term investments and successful long-term investment advisory, and also the willingness to recognize when to cut our losses, or for that matter, our clients' losses. The sooner we accept certain things that may or may not have gone well would be the best ingredient or formula for a healthy long-term relationship between investment advisors and their clients. Therefore, as a country, we should realize that we are in it for the longer haul, not for the short term. Therefore, delayed gratification over instant gratification, and basically putting our head down and working towards the goals we have, either as a country or in the world of investing, without succumbing to premature triumphalism and exuberance, are some of the other thoughts I want to leave with you today. Thank you very much. I hope you have a rest of the day, very fruitful, productive, and useful inputs for reflection. And I wish you all the very best, both in advising and in your own investment returns for the rest of 2024. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anantha, for that very insightful detail that you shared about the economy at large. And I love the fact that you reminded us to stay grounded and be real about how the situation is and not be over triumph, bring that into our conversations with the clients. Well, we have a few questions that we would like to bounce off with you, sir. May I please invite Mrs. Renu Maheshwari to please join us on stage and put out a few questions to Dr. Anantha. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. I don't know if you can see me, but
yeah, I can see you and I hear you well.
Okay, great. So very lovely to see you here, and thank you so much for taking this time out in spite of the very busy schedule that you have today. Thanks a ton.
You're welcome.
So your insights into our into the past of our country's economy was wonderful. I could hear the murmur at the back, that wonderful facts and things that we probably didn't realize or didn't see. But there are some questions, if you don't mind, can I continue with that?
Please.
There is this question which we sat together, few of us, and we all wanted to ask. There are things which are happening in our country. For example, provident fund monies moving into equity, global bond inclusion, our bonds getting included into the global indices. These are all once-in-lifetime events. How does it change the way we look at investment? And is it something like a decade not to be missed? Are people right in thinking of it as FOMO and worried about that if I don't invest in this decade, it will never come back again to me?
No, those are very good questions. And as you know very well, there are no universal answers. But let me try. First of all, patient money coming into equities and bond index inclusions are important, seminal, significant events. They do increase the opportunities for profits and returns to investing. But will they, in and of themselves, generate or guarantee investment returns? The answer is no. Think about it carefully. More money coming from long-term sources into the investment capital market, whether it is debt or equity, is actually about demand for securities. There is an increase in demand for securities when more money comes in. That can actually lead to short-term bubble-like phenomena. But whereas what you need is also supply, the market has to become broader and wider. That is why it is good news that India's top 5 or top 10 equity concentration in terms of their market cap as a percentage of the overall market cap is not as high as it is, for example, in the United States or other countries at the moment. So that's an important thing. So what is required is, yes, these are definitely epochal or defining events, but simultaneously, we need also to see growth becoming broad-based, more companies becoming part of the indices, and simultaneously in the bond index inclusion, etc., also should make us aware of the possibility that some of this money could be hot money, in other words, not patient money. And sometimes this could also make us more susceptible to influences, to events happening elsewhere, because an investor who is facing losses elsewhere may use this to repatriate the money from India to cover his or her losses elsewhere, and in the process, trigger instability in our markets for no fault of our fundamentals. All these challenges and risks will arise. So I would definitely consider them as opportunities for investors, but also be aware that if simultaneously the underlying economic strength doesn't continue, which luckily in our case is continuing, then only increase in demand side but no commensurate increase in supply side will mean only price bubbles. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Quite useful for our day-to-day practice, at least for me, for the answers that I got. One more question, follow-up question on the same thing, and this is something which I feel like asking every expert I meet. Does it mean when the country grows in such a manner, and we are seeing that kind of a differential growth right now, and we see different kinds of money flowing into the market, does it mean that we can see a resetting of PE values, acceptable PE values, and so those acceptable norms of markets being expensive or cheap kind of resets?
Yeah, well, I didn't think that this session is about investment advice to investment advisors.
We keep looking for that wherever we get a place, sir.
And these are eternal questions with elusive answers. Ultimately, listen to that voice in the corner of your heart. Sometimes if it tells you if some things are too good to be true, probably they are not. So in other words, whether there is a permanent structural re-rating, or is it a bubble, or is it a combination of the two? And all these things are questions that do not have permanent or one-time invariable answers. Context matters as much as the underlying. One second. Context matters as much as the underlying valuations matter. I think the real answer is you have to listen to your own inner voice as to what it tells you. Because I always used to believe that discipline in investing is equivalent to being spiritual, because it requires you to listen to that voice of conscience that tells you and not to go with the crowd. I also mentioned in the course of my remarks that passivity and inactivity are part of investment discipline. Sometimes the willingness to defy the crowd and not be part of it is a huge temptation to resist. If you can resist that temptation and be disciplined, that is being spiritual. So I think the answer to your question is there is no straightforward answer. I can tell you whether there is a permanent re-rating or whether it is a fad or a bubble. That is something that you need to figure out yourself, depending on both the fundamental factors and also about the short-term market sentiments, etc., and so on. In general, you all might have heard about the fact that, you know, when you must buy when there is not a single good word to be said about something, which means all people who wanted to sell have sold out. And you sell when not a single bad word can be heard about, or a risk concern can be heard about a particular country or a market, etc. So in other words, these are all time tested investment philosophies, and the best thing is to read the blogs of Morgan Housel. The price of, I think his latest book, forget the name, Morgan Housel, or for that matter, Mr. Warren Buffett's latest newsletter. All these things will guide you appropriately. Ultimately, follow your core instinct and not so much what the fad or the crowd is doing. The willingness and the courage to stand out from the crowd is what will enable you to be long-term successful advisor. I know that I haven't answered your question straightforwardly because there is no straightforward answer to this. Back to you.
Thank you very much for that. You have indirectly answered the question. We at least know what actions to take. And coming back to spirituality, that's the reason we have a concept of Shiva Shakti along with the leaders like you addressing all of us. Our MC has also brought in that concept and we will be doing some exercises during the day, friends, around that, because it's like you said, it's important that we develop that calmness and spirituality within ourselves to be able to help our advisors. So there is one more question, and this is something which a lot of us talk in India. Wealth industry in India came only a couple of decades back. So we are probably the first generation people who are over here as wealth advisors. What is it that we need to be looking at the rest of the world or the developed world? And we have two experts, one from Australia and one from US to address us today. We also want to understand what is it that we should be taking from there, and what is it that might be different in our case in terms of wealth growth and investment philosophies?
I think it's a very broad question, and it's not possible to do justice to that question in the short time that we have. But I think the more important thing is, in a developing country, which is currently a lower middle income country, but which is on course to become a middle income country, it is quite natural that return opportunities will arise, but also volatility will be on the higher side. So that is actually going to be much more rewards for being patient and a long-term investor. Whereas in developed countries, growth can happen only if there is constant innovation. There are no natural organic drivers of growth because that has been exhausted. Whereas in a country like India, and given its size, where each state is a country by itself, and it is not necessary or possible to concentrate only in a few sectors. Almost every sector, whether it is capital goods, whether it is consumption, whether it is services, all sectors have opportunities to grow, or for that matter, health and pharma. So in a developing country like ours, I think the sectoral opportunities and the rewards for long-term investing are all likely to be much higher than it is in developed countries at this point. And therefore, also the possibility of the re-rating of the country and the market, and therefore gaining higher share in indices going forward, will also bring in more money. So in fact, the biggest ingredient for success in our markets is going to be to remember that compared to several other countries, there is a greater opportunity for reward to patient and long-term investing. To remember that lesson is the biggest distinguishing factor or differentiator for investing in a developing country like ours compared to developed countries.
Great. So to me, it means that passivity will pay us better in India right now, probably. Is that so?
Yes, you could say that. I think
okay.
more than passivity, I would say investment discipline.
Got that. So discipline and discipline. That's the message we are getting constantly. Sir, there is one question about AI and which came from one of our members. How will India prepare for a world with artificial intelligence? We have so many people who, I wouldn't say we are not tech savvy anymore. We see every single person on the road, right from sugarcane juice vendor to everyone else using mobile payment systems. And also, I wouldn't call ourselves technologically primitive anymore. But at the same time, artificial intelligence can play a big role in taking away employment at a very starting entry-level jobs. Will we react to it, and how will it play out probably?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that these are still very early days. There is a lot of hype around artificial intelligence, but it has not yet gotten to the point where it is displacing jobs. At the moment, it is still creating jobs. And even within employment sectors, what might happen in developed countries might be different than what might happen in developing countries. Countries like India, given the labor cost advantage, may still be not as susceptible to job losses as it might be the case in developed countries. So I think it is important to be aware and watch the trends, but more than labor market dynamics of artificial intelligence, what is important to remember are the other risks that are coming with artificial intelligence, which is that its tendency to go rogue. And humans, the moment we can say that we can go from artificial intelligence to artificial general intelligence, where it reaches the level of consciousness, and you get to the point where it can do anything that humans can do or even better. And then for humans to be able to say that I can put in guardrails to control how the AI behaves, there is a contradiction in terms. So these are the aspects which we should be more concerned about. Are we really in control of, do we know what we are doing as technologists with respect to artificial intelligence? Its implications go beyond the labor market, because labor markets are not uniform or homogeneous across the world. What can be the consequence of AI in a developed country will be very different for a country like India. We may still benefit from it rather than losing out to AI. And therefore, it is not necessary for us to panic right now at the labor market dynamics of AI. We just need to be watchful. It's a very early days. It is difficult to give you definitive answers, but more than the labor market dimensions, there are these other dimensions of, are we realizing the limitations of what we are unleashing in terms of the unintended consequences of AI? Those are bigger worries than a labor market implication at this point for a developing country like India.
I think that was encouraging. Worrying about the limits on AI is beyond our pay grade, so we can't worry about it. But yes, labor market is something which we are concerned about, because we will see an immediate impact, and that was quite an helpful answer, sir. Would anyone like to ask sir some question? Yes.
Hi, sir. I'm Pallavi from NDTV Profit. So actually, mine is not so much an investment-related question. Thank you for the lovely presentation. I had a follow-up on that. In the early part of the presentation, you'd spoken about how private consumption and investments as well will be key drivers going forward. I just want some help in understanding how you're looking at consumption at this point. It's been a little bit of worry the past last year. GDP data for the past quarter too has not been particularly supportive. And I want to know, whether we can expect, whether you think we will see a revival in private consumption going forward. Currently, it's at about 2.5–3.5% YOY for Q3, I believe. And the divergence between investments and private consumption too is particularly wide. How would you perceive that at this point, and what's the way forward?
No, I think first answer is that quarterly data are not seasonally adjusted. And if second answer is high frequency indicators are pointing to the fact that consumption, whether you look at sales of two-wheelers, three-wheelers and passenger vehicles, or for that matter in air traffic and hotel occupancy rates, etc. And whether you look at the Nielsen IQ data, which we present in the monthly economic review of the DEA, where rural consumption growth actually has been slight improving. The growth rate has been rising quarter by quarter. So in other words, it is not that, as I mentioned also in my remarks, for a large country, one cannot expect all sectors to fire at all times. There will be some quarters we talked about agricultural growth being somewhat lackluster this year. That will naturally create a dual-paced growth for some time. But I also mentioned about the reasons why one can look ahead to an encouraging and better rural consumption in 2024. And we should basically realize that the purpose of doing investment growth is to ensure that it creates the multiplier effect, because it has got the highest multiplier effect on employment creation. And you see that in the EPFO data as well. And therefore, it is, while the reason why rural consumption growth has been relatively on the lower side compared to urban consumption is the fact that 40 million people or 4 crore people re-migrated back to their villages during the COVID time. And therefore, for them to come back into the urban India will also take slightly longer, and that is being facilitated by the rise in construction activity, real estate sector growth, and manufacturing now adding jobs. So it is something that is a process that will unfold and is unfolding. And the government's public investment has begun to crowd in the private sector, which will in turn lead to employment generation and job creation and income growth. Therefore, my expectation is that, just one second, let me just tell them to So I think the important thing is to realize that quarter-on-quarter data are not seasonally adjusted, that not all things will be firing on all cylinders at the same time. And there are encouraging signs, whether it is in rural consumption growth rates and the health of the urban consumption, and the investments made in infrastructure as well as other capital investment by the government is crowding in the private sector for employment generation and income growth over the years. Agricultural sector's fortunes look well poised to turn for the better this year, and therefore rural consumption, urban consumption gap should narrow in the course of 2024. These are my answers to your question.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Munot has a question to
Hi, Anantha, missing you in person, but always a pleasure to listen to you. And we are inspired by your words. We are all a believer in India growth story. We believe by 2047, we will be a developed country. We are the youngest country and will remain the fastest growing economy in the world for a long time. But by 2047, we'll also have very large number of old people in the face of longevity and lifestyle inflation. And we have a very short window to ensure that we don't become a rich country where there are a lot of people who don't have enough for their retirement. From a policy making, we are between ARIA, mutual fund industry, all of us are working very hard to spread this word. But from a policy making perspective, What do you think what need to be done to kind of support this? It was great of Prime Minister to talk about the growth of mutual fund industry, Finance Minister, all of you, SEBI chairperson, they keep talking about it. But is there something else that comes to mind that we don't get into a great retirement challenge after 25 years when we become a rich country?
No, I think it's a very good but open-ended question, Navneet, and it's difficult for me to spell out what we need to do. At the end of the day, the fact that we have 20 years window of demographic advantage and growth years are the years in which one actually ends up creating the safety net and safety nest that we build. Therefore, I think important ingredient of this is not only ensuring that the fruits of economic growth diffuse down to all people so that savings at even at lower deciles and quintiles and quartiles of the population start to accumulate savings. But more than that, I think continued investment in financial education, financial literacy, and also the virtues of long-term thinking when it comes to capital markets. Apart from the fact that policymakers have to keep creating the conditions for economic growth to sustain, not getting into another financial down cycle, this is what the policymakers can do. But as for the ability to create enough buffer and surpluses for the retirement years is as much consequence of policymakers' decisions and actions as it is that of the investment industry, as that of the individual saver themselves. So all of them also have to contribute. Now, this is where I think the important lesson I can tell for the industry is not to therefore see itself in an adversarial role vis-a-vis the regulators, but to see them as making sure that the foundation remains healthy for a long-term growth of the industry and for the long-term corpus of the households. So, in that sense, continued growth is one insurance. Growth of the market and growth of investment opportunities and therefore supply of equities and debt instruments is the other thing. Therefore, the growth in the capital markets itself is something that will be important factor in the in saving for retirement. Third, financial education and financial literacy. And four, long-term thinking. And five, for a synergistic relationship between regulators and the regulated. These will be the ingredients that will make the way for a retirement or a possible old age, a demographically graying India in 25, 30 years' time, not to face the same consequences that some of the developed countries are facing today. Back to you.
Thank you so much, sir. And this brings us back to Mr. Trivedi and all of us. We all keep talking about financial education, financial literacy. Our chief economic advisor of the country also is talking about the same thing. So I guess, the industry bodies need to come together more often to be able to work towards financial literacy in a very, very serious manner and structured manner. Mr. Trivedi would like to add something to it. Can you please pass the mic to him? Dr. Nageswaran, if you are not aware, Mr. Trivedi was part of SEBI. He was GM in SEBI earlier, and now he's with NISM as a, I shouldn't pronounce your designation wrongly, sir, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Fine. Good morning to you, sir. My name is Deepak Trivedi. I'm a CGM from SEBI on deputation to NISM. Sir, as you rightly said, the financial education is the core for the future growth. Only when we really teach the investors rightly that whatever investment today you are making is for a long-term perspective. And in this area, the role of the regulator, the role of National Institute of Securities Market, other agencies who are into the investor education era and area, they all have to play this role. More important is that this should reach to the ground level people. And for that, we need to have this education in the more vernacular language. For that, all the participants are playing very hard for that. Now, I'm sure that with the economic growth, the people today are digital savvy. they also will be digitally active in the savings also. Today we need to ensure that they get their all advisory, they get their all investment related information on their mobile. And for that, the regulator has done a lot of hard work in last 20 years. And we have the account aggregator model also, which is available, which is really making possible for the investors to know. I'm sure that this collective wisdom of everything will definitely lead to the question which raised by Mr. Munot, that somewhere the long-term plan or long-term saving will definitely make the retirement planning much more pleasant for everyone. They will have more disposable income to enjoy the life rather than thinking about only the medical treatment or something. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Sir, there is one. Would you like to add something, Dr. Nageswaran? Sorry.
No, I think I have to leave because just wanted to let you know
Sir,
that.
just one last question. Kanika has been raising her hand for a while. Just one question from one of the warriors.
Thank you, sir, for taking my question. You mentioned in the presentation about the strong economic growth momentum of our country. But as financial planners, we have a long-term outlook of about 2 to 3 decades, and we need to make projections of the economic growth and inflation. So my question to you is that if you put yourself in our shoes as a financial planner, what would be your outlook for economic growth and inflation for our country?
So if CEA was the investment advisor.
Yeah, I mean, look, the long-term outlook is definitely, as I mentioned very clearly, one cannot put a numerical value to this at the moment. I can't give you precisely year by year average growth rate, but as I said, for the next 7 to 10 years, given I mentioned the fact that the financial sector is in good health, corporate sector is in good health, investments are happening, and I also showed you in the charts that India's share of global GDP will keep rising. So naturally, for our investment, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, we are looking at a prospect of steady growth, which will take the economy size to from 3.5 trillion now to 7 trillion, etc. So that is about as good as it can get under the circumstances. Afterwards, projecting beyond that, I think we need to understand that the underlying conditions change, geopolitics might change. So for the next 7 to 10 years, I can say that notwithstanding all the challenges I mentioned about health, education, energy security, energy transition, etc., I think the various positive drivers I mentioned, infrastructure investment, good health of the financial and the corporate sector, and the creation of physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, all of this point to the fact that our dollar GDP is poised to double in the next 7 to 8 years. I think I have to go.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. Thanks. We can't thank you enough on behalf of ARIA Management Committee for making the time over here today. Thanks a ton. And thank you, Ramya, for connecting us with you. Thank you very much.